The silent room after the spotlight. It was one of those nights where the air shimmered with tension, nostalgia, and the heavy presence of time. The room had been full just moments before, laughs echoing off the marble, cameras flashing like erratic lightning, and voices tangled in stories from the past. Now silence reigned. Champagne glasses lay abandoned on white linen. The after-party was over, and the glitter had settled into the creases of the red carpet. Keanu Reeves stood near the edge of the ballroom, still in his classic black suit. The dimmed chandeliers cast a golden hue on his face, softening the lines time had drawn over the years. He wasn't a man obsessed with fame or applause. He never was. Tonight had been about honoring legacy, a tribute to over 2 decades since speed had cemented his and Sandra Bullock's on-screen magic. But underneath it all, something deeper stirred in him, a quiet ache he carried for years. And he wasn't ready to walk away just yet. From across the room, Keanu watched the last few people exit. Producers, stylists, assistants, industry faces who would tomorrow pretend this night never happened. But not him. He waited. Waited until even the cleanup crew had retreated to the back corridors. And only then, when the hum of life dimmed into nothing, did he walk toward the far end of the hall where Sandra had left her heels on a velvet stool and wandered barefoot toward the moonlight that streamed through the open balcony. A quiet reunion. Sandra Bullock was sitting alone on the wide stone ledge, her feet dangling over the side like a child at recess. She still wore her gown, a deep emerald green piece that shimmered against the night, but her back was slightly hunched. She wasn't the woman the world saw, not here, not now. Keanu didn't say anything right away. He just walked up slowly and sat beside her, letting the silence cradle them both. The wind danced with the ends of her hair. From below, the city glowed, unaware of the 2 stars above it. No scripts, no retakes, just 2 souls sharing a moment too sacred to be staged. "You stayed," Sandra finally said, her voice tired but calm. "I did," Keanu replied. Her head turned slowly toward him. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled something from the inside of his jacket. A small, worn notebook, leather-bound, with corners frayed and pages dog-eared. "This belonged to someone you might remember," he said softly. Sandra took it from him cautiously, her fingers brushing his. She opened the first page, her breath caught in her throat. It was a journal, but not just any journal, it was her mother's. Her late mother, who had passed away quietly years ago, far from the headlines, and on the first page was a note. "To my daughter, who always knew how to fly, even when the world tried to clip her wings." Tears welled in her eyes. How did you get this?" "The letter that changed everything." Keanu looked out over the city, his voice hushed. "When I was filming in Santa Fe a year ago, I ran into an antiques bookseller. I found the journal among a box of old donations. Something told me to flip through it. I saw her handwriting. I knew it had to be hers." Sandra's hand trembled as she turned the pages. Each one was filled with fragments, poems, affirmations, stories, letters to a younger Sandra, back when she was just a girl chasing dreams in theater school. There were entries from the days Sandra had her first heartbreak, notes from when she got her first acting job, hopes for the woman she would one day become. Keanu added gently, "I've been waiting for the right time to give it to you. Tonight just felt right." Sandra couldn't speak. A single tear slid down her cheek. She had smiled for cameras all night. She had laughed, reminisced, performed the charm expected of her. But no one had noticed the fatigue in her eyes. No one had heard the silence inside her heart, except him. And now she held the voice of her mother in her hands, restored not by fate but by Keanu's quiet act of kindness. It was beautiful not because it was grand, but because it was personal. It was love without demand. It was care without condition. Memories revisited. As Sandra slowly read passages aloud, her voice would crack, and Keanu would simply sit beside her, not interrupting, not consoling, just existing with her in that shared grief, in that shared peace. One passage read, "One day someone will love you in silence, not because they don't know how to shout it, but because they know how sacred your soul is." Sandra paused, her eyes flickering toward him. The way Keanu looked at her just then was different, not the look of a man infatuated, but of someone who had known and protected a love for so long that it had become part of his nature. They both knew it, no need to speak it. The promise made long ago. Then she whispered, "Do you remember what you told me the night of our first movie premiere?" Keanu looked over, brow furrowed gently. She smiled. "You said, even if we never do another movie together, I hope we write something better off-screen." He chuckled softly. I said that. You did, and I thought it was a line, something poetic. But now, looking at this, she held the journal to her chest, I realize you were always writing it, quietly, steadily, without expecting applause. Keanu looked down at his hands, then at her. We still have time, he said quietly. The lights no longer matter. The party, the career, the awards, all of it faded into the background. What remained was two people past their prime in the eyes of Hollywood, but at the beginning of something deeper. Not necessarily romantic, not yet, maybe never. But definitely soul deep. She leaned her head on his shoulder and he didn't flinch. He just let her rest there. For the first time in years, Sandra didn't feel like Sandra Bullock, the star, the brand, the symbol. She felt like Sandra, daughter of Helga, child of dreams, friend of Keanu. And Keanu, he finally felt like he'd done something meaningful, not for the world, not for fans, but for her. Fade out, a single note left behind. Long after they left the balcony, long after the cleaning crew returned and found empty wine glasses and napkins strewn about, there was one thing left on that stone ledge. A folded note in Sandra's handwriting, written on the back page of her mother's journal. It read, To the man who never needed the world to notice his love. Thank you for being my silence after the storm. The night he gave her back the quiet. The following morning arrived late, not because the sun hesitated, but because Sandra let herself stay still for once, drifting in the soft place between memory and breath where her mother's handwriting still glowed like a lamp behind her eyelids. The journal lay on her nightstand with a care that felt ceremonial, a relic returned to its rightful keeper. And as she traced the leather's worn edge, she realized how long it had been since she had allowed herself the indulgence of slowness, the sweet, stubborn act of doing nothing but feeling everything. In the world's eyes, she was a woman in motion, producing, scheduling, fixing, showing up. But inside, she had often lived in borrowed rooms of exhaustion. Now some private door had opened, and the air of that room smelled like the first page of a book that had waited decades to be read. Her phone buzzed under a pillow, the modern world's way of knocking without apology. But for once she didn't mind ignoring it. The night's quiet had rearranged her furniture, and she wanted to walk through the place again before letting anyone else in. Later, while the kitchen window was filling with the gentle light of late morning and the kettle hissed like an old friend clearing their throat, she found a small message from Keanu. Not a paragraph, not a plan, just a line that felt like a hand offered palm up. If you want to sit somewhere today where no one expects anything of you, I know a place. There was no address attached, no time, and yet she knew he would be exactly where he needed to be when she asked, as if he were built of patience more than of bone. She typed back, yes, before she knew where the word was going, then laughed at herself because consent had always come easily when the request was kindness. On her dining table, she spread the journal open and let its pages catch the light, and she thought of how many versions of herself her mother had spoken to. The teenage dreamer, the college hopeful, the woman stumbling from set to set like a traveling circus of one, and how an old love could become a new compass when you finally held it long enough. They met in the early afternoon on a side street that knew how to keep secrets. The city around them did the usual performative bustle, taxis arguing with the day, couples conducting their small negotiations about lunch and life. But the narrow theater alley seemed to exist 1 centimeter to the left of the world. Keanu stood at the end of it in jeans and a jacket that could have belonged to any decade, holding a ring of keys that jingled once like the overture of something small and sincere. He didn't explain, he didn't preface. He simply led her to the back entrance of an old playhouse whose name had been painted over so many times it looked like a palimpsest of applause. Inside, dust motes floated like slow confetti in the slanted light, the velvet seats were faded to a memory of red, and the stage waited the way a shore waits for a returning tide. They let me use it sometimes, he said with a shrug that was half apology, half gratitude. I told them I had a friend who needed somewhere that remembers how to listen. On stage sat a piano that had been tuned enough to be kind, but not enough to be proud. Sandra ran her hand along its body and felt a ripple of old concerts and rehearsals in the wood, the way instruments remember what people forget. She had studied voice long before scripts found her. The theater had been the first room that told her she was allowed to be loud and still be loved. Now she sat on the bench without ceremony, as if conversation with keys were a habit she'd recently rediscovered, and let her fingers find a simple progression she used to practice when she didn't know what else to do with grief. C, A, M, F, Gee, it was not sophistication she wanted. It was honesty, the little ladder some notes build for you when your heart is 2 floors below you. Keanu took a seat in the front row, far enough away to make silence big, close enough to let her know he would catch any falling piece of her that needed catching. She began to hum, then sing, not a song anyone would recognize, just the kind of melody that belongs to a person before it belongs to an audience. The theater answered with the kind of acoustics that explains why people fall in love with places. When the last chord settled, Keanu lifted a small tote from the aisle seat and brought it to the edge of the stage. "One more thing," he said with that careful tone he used when handing someone a newborn truth. From the bag he pulled thin folders, each labeled by hand, 1993 callbacks, 1994 table read notes, letters from casts and crews, fan mail kept for sole emergencies. She blinked, astonished. These were copies, neatly assembled from public archives and private collections, assembled by someone who had given time the job of love. "How?" she began, and he shook his head almost shyly. "A few friends owe me favors, some archivists owe nobody anything but like me anyway," he said with that half-smile that made trouble look like a service. "I thought maybe you'd like to remember yourself through other people's eyes, but on your terms. We can go through them and then lock them away again, or burn them, or turn them into paper planes, your call." She took the folders from him as though they might bruise and felt the strangest relief. Evidence of a life lived was not a burden if someone offered to hold it with you. Of course, the world is not a sanctuary just because you found one. By late afternoon, a headline had already escaped some careless mouth, an echo from the prior night, Reeves and Bullock. Balcony whispers, the kind of headline that is written as a question mark and read as a verdict. Her publicist texted twice, then thrice, then called, while a friend sent a screenshot studded with gossipy emojis, and for a moment the spell threatened to break. Sandra stood in the wings of the stage with her phone pulsing like a heartbeat. She felt the old tug toward choreography. Explain, deny, correct, get ahead, make a shape the cameras could not misinterpret. "I can tell them I was with you," she said, half to herself, "that you were returning something you found, that it was a memorial to my mother, not whatever they want." Keanu studied her with the patience of someone watching a wave decide whether to crash or curl. "You can," he said gently, "and I'll stand exactly where you need me. But you don't owe anyone your insides today. We came here for quiet. We can let the quiet do its job." She looked at him then with the startled gratitude of a person who has been granted permission to be human. She put the phone on airplane mode, and the theater sighed as if relieved to have its silence back. They spent an hour with the folders as if they were maps to countries they'd once toured together. In the 1994 table read notes, Sandra found an old scribble from a casting assistant. "SB brings warmth like a light you didn't notice was off until she turned it on." In a stack of letters from crew members on a late 90s film, there were little testimonies about coffee handoffs, the extra beats she gave every scene partner, the way she brought a birthday cake for a grip who thought he had been forgotten. And in fan mail kept for sole emergencies, there was a letter from a nurse who worked night shifts, who wrote that she watched Sandra's films on her dinner break at 2:15 a.m. and felt less alone. Halfway down the page, in a looping hand, the nurse added, "Thank you for making kindness look like an attainable muscle." Sandra pressed the letter to her chest and realized she had been starving for a sentence exactly like that. Keanu, for his part, read some lines aloud in that unhurried cadence that made prose sound like a confidant. "Here's one," he said. From a camera operator, Keanu showed up 20 minutes early to help load cases in the rain, then pretended he'd just arrived so we wouldn't be embarrassed. He looked up almost sheepishly. "I don't remember that," he said. She smiled. "That's precisely why it's true." As evening nudged its shoulder against the doors, Keanu asked if he could try something unusual. He walked backstage and returned with a metal music stand and a slim, battered portable speaker. From his pocket, he produced a tiny USB drive taped with the word Helga, her mother's name, and Sandra felt her breath catch at the edge of a cliff she hadn't known was in the room. "I didn't want to presume," he said quickly, almost apologizing with his eyes, "but the bookseller in Santa Fe mentioned an old microcassette in the same box as the journal, probably recorded for a friend. I had it digitized. It might just be grocery lists and recipes. We can listen for 5 seconds and stop. It's fully your call." The theater seemed to draw in its lungs. Sandra reached for the drive, then paused, then nodded with a steadiness that surprised her. "Let's let the room meet her," she said, and handed it back to him like a key to somewhere necessary. The first crackle sounded like rain on a roof in a childhood she almost remembered. Then a voice, wobbly with tape age yet inexplicably intact, filled the theater with the strange miracle of a person arriving from the other side of all the distances. "Mein liebe Sandra," the voice began, then switched into English as if stepping into a warmer coat. "I'm talking to you because I know one day you will need to hear me more than you can bear that I am gone." Sandra sat, spine straight as a string, hands knotted gently in her lap. The voice moved through a few anecdotes about rehearsals and boiled potatoes and the unstoppable choreography of ordinary life, then landed softly on something that made the room feel like a chapel. "You will think the world loves you for what you do," her mother said carefully. "But I am recording this to remind you that the best part of you will always be who you are when no one is watching. Trust the person you are when you are washing dishes. That girl is the one I raised." The sentence curled through the air and found a home in both of them. Keanu lowered his head as if saluting a flag that needed the gesture more than he did. They listened to a few minutes, then stopped when listening became a kind of ache that asked for intermission. There are griefs you carry like instruments. You don't destroy them, you learn to play them without breaking. Sandra stood, walked to the apron of the stage, and studied the empty rows the way a sailor studies a horizon. "I have built cathedrals out of being fine," she said finally, and the confession echoed in the curtains, in the fly system, in the gentle arch of the balcony. "But I don't want to be fine tonight. I want to be specific." Keanu joined her, not touching, just near. "Specific how?" he asked, as if specificity were a country he'd gladly visit with her passport. She thought for a long moment, like a swimmer measuring how cold the lake will be at her waist. "I want to remember who I was before good news became another meeting," she said quietly. "I want to leave a message for somebody the way she left one for me. Not for a movie, not for promotion, just for some kid who doesn't yet know that kindness counts twice, first to the world, then to yourself." So they made a plan with no audience in mind. Keanu fetched a small handheld recorder from the tote, because of course he carried a tool for ordinary magic, and placed it on the music stand. The red light glowed like a small, patient ember. Sandra spoke into it with the intimate courage of a person writing a letter to the stranger she used to be. She talked about the day she almost quit, and the stranger who complimented her work ethic at the coffee shop without knowing he was talking her out of a resignation. She talked about losing people in quiet seasons when the world assumes you are loud with happiness. She talked about the practical steps of forgiving yourself for not being tireless. She ended with the sentence she hadn't planned but seemed to be waiting in her mouth. "If you're listening to this someday, I want you to know that the work you do on your heart is not invisible. It is the architecture of every room you will one day invite people into." When she clicked the recorder off, the theater seemed to bow. Sometimes sacredness is nothing more than two people making something honest and leaving it to cool in the air. They locked the theater and stepped into the blue hour, that merciful stretch when the city pauses between posturing and rest. A food truck around the corner sold tacos to construction workers and accountants with equal reverence, and they ate leaning against the brick wall, laughing at how salsa can fix most of a day. It would have been easy to call the night finished there, to let tenderness end on the public sidewalk where real life likes to sign its name. But Keanu had one last quiet intention, the kind that never makes headlines because it refuses to raise its voice. He hailed a taxi and gave an address that sounded more like a suggestion than a destination. A small community center in a neighborhood whose murals did better journalism than the newspapers. Inside, in a multi-purpose room that smelled faintly of gym floor polish and crayons, a dozen folding chairs formed a loose circle. On a corkboard, a handwritten flyer read, "Story bench, Wednesdays at 8. Bring a memory, leave with someone S." He'd been donating anonymously to keep the lights on, and sometimes he came to listen when the world made too much noise. He asked Sandra if she wanted to sit in as a stranger, and she nodded, tugging a baseball cap low like a spell. A kid spoke about teaching his father how to use a smartphone and how patience is just love lifting weights. A nurse described the first patient she lost, and the day she learned how to hold a family's silence without filling it. An older man confessed he had started carrying dog treats in his pocket so he could befriend the neighborhood dogs because he missed a dog he'd had for 15 years. Everyone laughed, and then didn't. No one knew who Sandra was, not in the way the world would have announced her, which meant they could know her for real when she eventually cleared her throat and said, simply, that she was practicing how to be loved without performing. She didn't mention the journal or the tape or the balcony. She gave them the shape of her day without the brand name, and the room did what rooms like that do. It held. Keanu listened with his whole face, that rare gift of attention that feels like a blanket rather than a spotlight. And in that circle, she realized the most radical thing he had done for her today was not the theater or the archives or the tape. It was the choreography of privacy, the way he kept bringing her to places where her soul didn't have to wear makeup. When they finally said goodnight at the curb, the air had the satisfied temperature of a day that had done its job. They didn't promise anything cinematic, didn't swaddle the moment in declarations. He said he'd send her digital copies of the recordings in the morning. She said she'd label the folders with something frivolous like cake recipes just to make Snoops bored. He laughed. She rolled her eyes fondly. But as she slid into the backseat, she hesitated and leaned toward the open window. "You waited last night until everyone left," she said, "and today you gave me rooms where I could be nobody and still be whole." He nodded, not as acknowledgement but as agreement to a contract neither had to sign. "We all deserve a place where applause can't reach," he replied. The driver pulled away, and in the rearview she watched him shrink to a figure under a streetlight, hands in pockets, a sentry posted at the border between spectacle and life. Back home, she placed the journal on her desk and the little recorder beside it, like a mother and child reunited in a new city. She powered on her phone and braced for chaos, but instead found a quiet message from him, time-stamped 2 minutes after she'd left. "When you need the theater again, it'll remember you." She typed nothing back, not because there was nothing to say, but because some answers are better paid in showing up. Before bed, she pressed play on her mother's voice for exactly 12 seconds and then stopped, the way you let chocolate dissolve without biting. Then she opened a new notebook and wrote a letter to the future listener who might one day need her the way she had needed a voice tonight. She signed it with her full name, then crossed out the last name and left Sandra. The girl at the sink her mother had loved was still there. She had simply been waiting for someone to turn off the crowd. When sleep came, it came like the tenderest usher, guiding her to a seat that faced a stage she finally wanted to see. And in the hush before dreams, as the house lights dimmed in her chest, she felt a strange, confident peace about tomorrow, not because it would be easy, but because she had tasted what it meant to be met without demand. Outside, the city made its tired noises. Inside, a quieter architecture took shape. If part 1 had been the return of a relic, part 2 was the blueprint for staying human while the world asks you to be a monument. Somewhere across town, a man who keeps his promises sat at a kitchen table labeling a folder "Soul Emergencies," Sandra, and smiled at how the smallest beautiful things, done after everyone leaves, echo the longest when the room is finally empty. The day the world knocked, and he answered with a door. By morning, the world had found its teeth again, and it used them with the brittle enthusiasm of people who confuse speculation for participation. 1,000 tabs opened on 1,000 laptops, faces with ring lights attached to microphones flattening 2 lives into something easier to pass around. A photo from the alley, a blur from the balcony, a sentence taken from a 10-year-old interview and steered into the shape of a prophecy. By noon, there were entire narratives authored by strangers who preferred plot over person. Sandra woke to the dull percussion of it all and felt, for a passing second, the familiar instinct to solve the weather, to issue a statement that would drain the sky. But then her eye fell on the leather-bound journal and the small recorder beside it, and instead of tapping out a rebuttal, she poured coffee, stood barefoot at the kitchen island, and played 12 seconds of her mother again. "Trust the person you are when you are washing dishes." She rinsed the cup slowly, as if obedience to that line could be practiced like an etude, and when her phone thrummed with the first of 3 urgent calls, she put it face down as if it were a book she wasn't ready to finish. Choice by choice, she arranged her morning into something resembling agency. A long shower without the news, eggs in a pan with more patience than heat, the old blue sweater that had snuck into more comfort than any couture ever purchased for a premiere. If anyone asked later what she did with the first day of the new rumor cycle, the answer would be neither glamorous nor monetizable. She dared to keep her nervous system human. The knock at noon was Keanu. He had learned her rhythms well enough to know that some silences were busy working, but a courier with a plain envelope and a typewritten label that read "From a bookstore that misses you." Inside was a hand-drawn map on stationery from the Santa Fe bookseller, lines as simple as a childhood treasure hunt, marking a modest address with an asterisk and a note in round, meticulous handwriting. The woman who donated the box with the journal moved back to Lowe's Angels. She asked if the journal ever found its way to please tell the finder that there were more things to return. The map ignited a nervous hope she didn't know where to place, the way a sudden smell can return you to a house that no longer stands. She texted the photo to Keanu with a single line, "There might be more." And almost immediately his reply arrived, unadorned but steady. "I'll drive." He didn't add anything tactical or dramatic. It was the kind of offer that respects your unimaginable, the kind that understands the best vehicle for grief is not speed, but companionship moving at the speed of breath. They drove without narrative the way some people breathe without commentary. The highway a long, forgiving ribbon, his old truck mercifully anonymous. The windows cracked just enough to let the day draft through like a low-stakes hymn. Conversation unfurled in a tone that made words feel optional. A sideways laugh about the taco truck salsa that had bullied both of them into humility the night before. A memory of a rehearsal room with a broken thermostat that had forced a cast to choose between sweat and sweaters. The strange relief, she confessed, of being in motion without destination headlines. At a light, he pointed to a mural on the side of a laundromat, a saintly woman holding a constellation of everyday objects above her head. A spatula, a wrench, a notebook, a stethoscope, and said almost to himself, "Someone out there keeps painting the patron saints of ordinary days." She thought about her mother's line and the sink, about the girl at the story bench learning to practice being loved without performing, and felt the click of a small alignment inside her chest, as if a watch had resumed true time. She realized that with him, movement never felt like running away, only like moving toward the part of the map that hadn't been surveyed by other people's stories. The address on the map belonged to a triplex sun-warmed into friendliness by a mulberry tree leaning over its fence like a gossiping ant. A woman in her 60s opened the door with a posture that suggested both caution and hospitality, a combination common to those who have learned to expect both beauty and disruption from knocks. Her name was Lot, a friend of Sandra's mother from a choir they once joined for the gossip and the harmonies. And she recognized Sandra with the compassionate nonchalance of someone who had known her when the famous last name was just a sound trailing after a small, determined girl. In her living room, the planet of their past wobbled back into orbit. Snapshots in curling albums of rehearsal halls and potlucks, notes on sheet music annotated with jokes in German and English, a pencil portrait of a younger Sandra done by a classmate who later became a nurse, and according to a note tucked behind the frame, never stopped treating the world's breathless moments. Lot explained, while making tea with bewildering efficiency, that after Helga's passing she had boxed up some of the ephemera, but in a season of moving had mislabeled a carton and, so stupid, I know, left it at a donation center with cookbooks and travel guides. When she heard, through a mutual friend of a friend, that a certain store had found something resembling a journal and that a polite man with kind eyes and a Canadian thank you had taken an interest, she'd asked the universe to do her one last favor. "And here you are," she finished, surprised into a laugh that sounded like an apology to fate. "Here we are," Sandra echoed, and the words felt as accurate as coordinates. There were other things. Oh, there were other things. A small cassette recorder with pastel stickers peeling at the edges, labeled in block letters, warm-ups plus silly songs. A brittle envelope of letters from a community theater in Virginia thanking Helga and little Sandy for volunteering to sew hems until midnight during Tech Week. A recipe card in her mother's hand for a simple almond cake with a note at the bottom, an arrow pointing to the line about sifting sugar. "Do not rush this part. Sweetness is shy and needs coaxing." And something wrapped in tissue that turned out to be a long silk scarf perfumed with a memory no bottle could manufacture. But at the bottom of the box was the thing that made the air step back and bow. A composition notebook with a cover like old asphalt, its first page titled in Helga's handwriting, "Lessons for When I Am Not There." There were no chapters, no stubborn insistence on order, just small essays addressed to a future. On audition days, on waiting rooms, on the difference between privacy and secrecy, on how to leave a dinner early without hurting anyone, on what to do when someone insists on telling the wrong story about you. Keanu sat on the floor, cross-legged without irony, and listened as Sandra read passages aloud that were so practical they felt like magic disguised as instructions. "When a rumor arrives," one entry proposed, "consider this. Is your life asking for a correction or a redirection? Correct when necessary to keep harm from spreading. Redirect whenever possible toward the work that adds light. The rest is just someone else's boredom dressed as a lion." She read that line twice and felt a seam mend in a place she hadn't even noticed was frayed. They helped Lot label and archive the box as if they were volunteers at the museum of one woman's invisible genius, and when Sandra asked if she could scan and return what she took, Lot waved the question away and replaced it with benediction. Your mother liked to say the heart has a circulation system that includes friends, she said. So take what needs to move to keep the blood good. On their way out, as if finishing a lingering note, Lot pressed a folded page into Sandra's hand. A photocopy of Helga's program from a choir concert, the back covered in scribbles that look like grocery lists until you read them aloud and realized they are, each one, a sentence for survival. In the truck, Sandra laughed through tears at one of them. Never trust a person who wants you to be endlessly impressive. Then she went quiet and squeezed the paper as if it were a rail on a moving train. I'm tired of being impressive, she said finally, not as a complaint but as a new logistical parameter. I want to be precise. Keanu turned the engine over and nodded with a relief that looked like recognition. Precision's the only fame that sticks, he said, and they drove back toward the city with the gentle speed of people transporting a miracle and trying not to jostle it. What greeted them at the edge of Lowe's Angels was the predictable choreography of noise, paparazzi eddies on the boulevard, a cluster of microphones orbiting a guess. But what surprised her was not the noise itself. It was the way her nervous system didn't immediately bend to it. She had her mother's paragraph in her pocket and the smell of almond cake in her imagination. She had a plan that wasn't a plan so much as a posture. She called her publicist and said, with a calm that felt like new furniture, that there would be no denial issued, no tell-all shaped to cauterize gossip with more story. Instead, there would be a small video to be posted the next afternoon, 2 minutes long, stating only what was true and relevant. She had been gifted personal items of her late mother by a longtime friend and would be donating a portion of her archive to a community program that helped preserve small histories, and that any other speculation would be corrected by silence as often as possible. Correct or redirect, she said softly after she hung up, trying the phrase on her tongue like a line cue. Keanu heard her and smiled into the middle distance, that place where he collects phrases he plans to live against. And then, because redirection without creation is just abstinence, they went to build something. The community center where Story Bench met on Wednesdays was open for after-school hours, the multi-purpose room filling gradually with the minor chaos of kids in possession of both energy and pencils. The director, a woman named June who treated people like ongoing projects of the heart, had a problem that would have paralyzed a lesser soul. The city had cited them for not having adequate climate control in the storage room where the neighborhood's oral history tapes lived, and unless they could raise the money and find the labor to fit the space with basic shelving and a portable climate system, the tapes would be moved to a facility 2 bus lines away, which would in practice mean nobody in the neighborhood would ever listen to them again. It's not a tragedy, it's just the kind of loss that accumulates into forgetting, she said, like someone who had spent a life learning the measurements of erosion. Keanu asked questions the way a builder asks the room where it wants doors. Sandra asked what materials were needed and what the schedule of least disruption might be. June blinked at both of them with private hope she was careful not to inflate. They didn't make promises. They asked for a broom, then a tape measure, then a notepad, and started solving inches before fundraising letters. By sundown, there were lists on clipboards and handshakes with volunteers and a shared calendar with tasks that looked satisfyingly bite-sized. June texted a board member, "I think help just walked in wearing a sweater and a quiet," and went to find zip ties. That night in Sandra's kitchen, where the island, blessedly, has never asked for a red carpet, Keanu sifted powdered sugar into a bowl with a patience that would have made Helga proud, while Sandra traced the almond cake recipe with the focus of a pilgrim and the loose elbow of a daughter relaxing into her inheritance. They baked 2, one for Lot, to be delivered with flowers and a note saying, "For gossip and harmonies," and one for the Story Bench team working late to draft a grant application before a deadline that didn't care about anyone's emotional arcs. The house filled with the kind of smell that makes critics unnecessary, an atmosphere that arranges everyone's faces into softer versions of themselves. Between oven checks, they sorted the lessons for when I am not there into a simple taxonomy, labeling each page with a sticky note for the scanning session they planned for morning. A domestic archive forming on the dining table like a small nation reclaiming its borders. They talked about a 2-minute video not as public relations but as instructional design. How to say exactly enough and no more. How to point to the real work, the storage room, the tapes without turning it into a spectacle. How to make it safe for silence to be a complete sentence. They practiced lines until they sounded like people and not like statements, and when the timer buzzed, they ate slices standing up over the sink, the way joy sometimes prefers to be consumed. The video they shot the next afternoon was not a confession booth or a performance. Just a woman in a chair, no makeup note needed because dignity has its own light, speaking with the steady cadence of someone reading a recipe for keeping a life from boiling over. She thanked a friend without naming him, referenced her mother without borrowing grief for effect, and then, with a half-smile that made sincerity aerodynamic, invited anyone with a shoebox of family tapes to consider bringing them to a neighborhood center rather than leaving them in the attic to be silently devoured by summer. "The famous stories have publishers," she said, "but the ones that saved us live in kitchens and storage rooms. We're making a better storage room." She ended with a line lifted verbatim from Helga's notebook. "Kindness is not what you do when you have extra time. It's how you keep time from becoming an enemy." She posted it, and then powered down, not as a grand gesture, but as a boundary set with a fingertip. By evening, the comments were less about balcony whispers and more about grandmothers and mixtapes and a dozen small towns where someone was starting to label a box with a pen that had finally found its proper job. What no one saw, what no one will ever see because it doesn't belong to anyone but the two of them, happened after the cake drop-off and the hardware store run and the trip home where the city's sunset tried to outdo itself. Keanu parked in his quiet spot under the sky that made even Lowe's angels remember it is a place on Earth. And from the truck bed, he lifted a long, slender case that looked like it would contain something orchestral or absurdly fragile. On her porch, he opened it to reveal a hand-carved wooden plaque, the kind you might find in an old library and only notice on your fourth visit, beautifully lettered but unshowy. The HELGA-B room, for voices that might have been lost. He had commissioned it years ago for a different project that had fallen apart, kept it wrapped and waiting because he couldn't bear to give it to a blank wall. "I thought we could hang it above the new shelves when they're in," he said, and his voice did that quiet-edge thing it does when sentiment risks overtaking speech. She took the plaque with both hands, as if it were the kind of fragile that isn't about material but meaning, and felt a rush of gratitude so elemental it bypassed words and went straight to breath. She leaned the wood against the wall inside her door and turned back to him, wanting to say something that would be equal to the moment, and relieved not to find such a sentence. Some mathematics are better left to a future scene. "Let's build the shelves first," she said, like a promise disguised as logistics. Sleep that night wore a different temperature, not the fatigued collapse of outrunning a day, but the earned rest of urging a day to behave. Somewhere in the small hours, between a dream of a choir rehearsal and the soft clicking of the house adjusting to the cool, she woke and wrote a single sentence in the notebook she kept by the bed, not to be read aloud or posted or summited, simply to set the agenda of her insides. "I will not confuse being seen with being loved, being efficient with being alive, being impressive with being precise." She underlined precise because the word felt like a compass in a pocket, then fell back into sleep so clean it could have been bottled. Across town, Keanu sat at his kitchen table sanding the corner of a 2x4 he planned to donate, in case we run short. The radio low, the house a cooperative of quiet objects. He thought about how waiting until everyone leaves is not about secrecy, but about making room for the kind of beautiful that cannot stand crowds. He thought about the plaque and the sugar sifted patiently, and the 100 inches yet to be measured in a small storage room that would, if they did their job, become a sanctuary for a neighborhood's memory. He smiled without needing an audience, and wrote on a scrap of paper the only line that felt like a thesis he could live by. Build the room and let the voices decide what they need. In the morning they would scan pages, buy brackets, organize volunteers, and post a sign-up sheet that asked more for patience than for funds. But for now, the night did what nights do when invited politely. It held their outlines in the soft mathematics of rest. Two people who had chosen the long way home and were therefore already quietly there. Blueprints for a room that remembers. The morning unfurled with the stubborn brightness of a day determined to be useful, and from the first clink of mugs on the counter, Sandra felt an unusual steadiness humming beneath her ribs, as if the previous nights had installed a silent metronome that kept time only for what mattered. There were errands to run and documents to scan and phone calls to return, but all of it orbited one clear star. Turn a neglected storage closet into a small, dignified archive where the neighborhood's fragile tapes could be kept safe without asking them to leave home. Keanu arrived carrying a canvas tool roll that looked older than half the buildings on the block, and when he unrolled it on the island, the choreography of the day announced itself. Measuring tape and pencils, a small level with a bubble that migrated like a patient bead, a portable drill, a wedge of sandpaper he'd snapped into thirds because the factory shape never quite fits the corners that actually need smoothing. They ate toast standing up as they plotted the order of operations. Scan Helga's notebook so the original could be sealed and rested. Send files to Lot with a note promising a cake repeat upon request. Pick up brackets and shelf standards. Confirm volunteer shifts. And check in with June about the electrician who had struck a truce with the community center's antique wiring. The city's hum beyond the windows sounded like traffic, but in her kitchen it translated to tempo, and for the first time in a long while Sandra's workday resembled life rather than a compliance test administered by strangers. She printed a simple sign for the center that read, "The Helga B. Room, work in progress, love in progress, memories in progress." And beneath the words she drew a small sink in ballpoint, a private nod to the lesson she kept relearning every morning. Trust the person you are when you are washing dishes, then build from there. At the center, the storage room greeted them with the blunt honesty of spaces that weren't designed for reverence. Gray concrete, a window painted shut, a single light that hummed like a fly when switched on, floor pocked with the stutters of old leaks. Yet even in its current state, there was the unmistakable invitation that patient rooms extend when they sense intention enter their air, as if four walls can tell the difference between being used and being asked to collaborate. June appeared with a clipboard and the gentle urgency of someone balancing 10 fires and 13 cups of water, introducing the volunteers as they filed in. A high school senior named Micah who could cut straight lines in wood with the unruffled attention of a surgeon and wore a t-shirt that said, "Leave a note, not a footprint." A retired electrician called Mr. Reyes who'd worked the docks and the studios and preferred to be paid in empanadas if at all possible. A librarian from the branch down the street willing to advise on cataloging in exchange for the right kind of cookies. And two mothers who kept this place breathing by sheer will and who insisted on doing everything that looked too heavy because, as one of them joked, "We spent 10 years lifting strollers. Our backs know the truth." Keanu sketched the wall layout on a sheet of craft paper with a carpenter's pencil, while Sandra taped painter's tape on the floor to show where boxes would live temporarily. And for an hour the room sounded like an orchestra tuning. Pencil on paper, tape tearing, gloves snapping, laughter ricocheting off concrete, Mr. Reyes humming a melody from the 70s to coax the light into behaving, and the small, contagious sound of decisions being made without drama. Of course, days that want to matter are rarely allowed to proceed without being tested. By late morning, the building inspector arrived with the careful frown of those whose job requires suspicion to look like concern, and he measured the clearance by the door and the width of the aisles, and the load-bearing optimism of a wall that was never asked to shelter a neighborhood's history. And then he cleared his throat and delivered the kind of sentence that scrapes. The plan as drawn would technically pass if the shelves stayed under a certain weight. But if the center wanted to invite the public into the room as anything more than an employee-only closet, they would need a different fire-rated door and a small ventilation upgrade that the budget did not yet recognize as possible. June steadied herself against the door jamb with an expression that refused melodrama, the hard-earned neutrality of someone who has learned to absorb small, bureaucratic earthquakes without letting them reroute entire rivers. Keanu asked questions instead of offering promises, switching fluently from kindness to specificity, inquiring about models and lead times and whether a donor could provide materials directly. Sandra, listening, felt the old adrenaline begin to request a performance. Write a check big and public, fix it in one grand gesture that could be screenshotted and devoured. But her mother's notebook in her bag felt like a steady hand on her wrist, and she took the quieter route. She asked the inspector his name, thanked him for being precise rather than punitive, and asked for the exact language that would satisfy code, then wrote it down verbatim like a recipe. When he left, the room exhaled, and they revised the plan the way committed people do, not by treating the rules as enemies, but by inviting them into the architecture until compliance felt like part of the design. The scanning session that followed should have been boring, which is why it felt holy. Sandra sat at a borrowed flatbed scanner while Micah created a simple assembly line, sticky notes labeled by theme, a soft brush for dust, cotton gloves that made everyone look like well-meaning mimes, and Keanu tended the laptop, naming files with a logic they could both recognize later. HB Lesson Privacy Secrecy V1, HB Audition Days V2, HB Kindness Keeps Time V Final because we mean it. They spoke little, the way people do when the work itself is meaning enough. And as the pages slid across glass and appeared on screen, Sandra felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel during a scan or a shoot or a meeting for years. Enoughness, the sensation that what was in her hands was exactly the right size for the heart that needed it. Halfway through a stack, she found a page she didn't remember seeing, a small essay titled On Panic and Precision, in which her mother wrote in tenderly practical paragraphs about those hours when the body believes it is on a cliff even in a kitchen, recommending, alongside the obvious call a friend and open a window, the less obvious place your hand flat on a steady table and name 5 objects that were present in this room before you were born. Sandra read the lines aloud and the room went gentle, each person absorbing the advice into whatever private pocket had been waiting for it. She set her palm on the table, oak nicked solid, and named out loud the ceiling, the wall, the floor, the window frame, the idea of a room. The quiver inside her quieted as if the house itself had decided to lend her its bones. They broke for lunch in the courtyard with paper plates balanced on knees. Food arriving in the unplanned way meals do when people decide to build something together. Empanadas from Mr. Ray's daughter, cut fruit delivered in a bowl the size of a bass drum. A tray of cookies from the librarian who admitted she'd been waiting her whole career for an excuse to bake a second batch of the lemon ones. And 2 still warm slices of almond cake that June had saved from last night's delivery, for a moment deserving of crumbs. The talk ping-ponged between logistics and the stories those tapes might contain once safe. Wedding toasts delivered in accents born elsewhere. A teenager's first poem written to survive a summer. A grandmother explaining how to cook beans correctly because life is long and you will need beans many, many Thursdays. A boy wandered over from an after-school class and asked if today's work was paid or rescued, and Sandra, delighted by the taxonomy, thought a long beat before answering. "Today we're paid in future listening," she said, and the boy nodded like someone who'd already learned that almost anything can be currency in the right economy. The afternoon had its own mood, a bit more sawdust, a bit more arithmetic. Shelves were anchored into studs with the satisfying certainty of things that will now hold. The electrician coaxed the light to stop humming and cabled a small vent with the absence of drama that comes from experience. And Keanu showed Micah how to scribe a shelf to a wall that would not submit to straight, teaching the difference between forcing and fitting with a patience that turned a small carpentry trick into a moral lesson disguised as a pencil mark. A hiccup arrived when one of the box trolleys decided to confess its age by shedding a wheel mid-turn, sending a column of tapes toward the ground like a slow-blooming heart attack. Without headlines or heroics, 3 people simply crouched and transformed their laps into a temporary shelf until empty hands could be fetched. And Sandra, kneeling in the midst of it, realized that this, more than any photo, was the truest image of the work they were doing. Knees on the floor, gravity acknowledged and negotiated with. A fragile story held between strangers who had decided to be neighbors in a practical way. Inevitably, the noise outside tried to set the agenda inside. A glossy outlet emailed offering a generous donation in exchange for exclusive access to the emotional journey. A phrasing that always sounds like someone asking to borrow your lungs. A PR team pitched a filmed walkthrough for transparency, which is often code for spectacle. And an anonymous donor offered a door, exactly the fire-rated model they needed, provided the plaque above it included a line about who had paid, a sentence that would announce itself before any voice could be heard. The team gathered in the hallway, dust on their jeans and pencil behind Keanu's ear, and weighed the offers with the sobriety of people who had been tricked by glitter before. June listed what acceptance would cost in attention and calendar pages. The librarian suggested alternate grant options. Mr. Ray's raised a thoughtful eyebrow at the idea of a donor plaque, introducing an archive dedicated to voices rather than names. And Sandra recited aloud the line from her mother's lesson on rumors. Correct when necessary, redirect whenever possible. They declined politely, publicly to the extent required, and set up a tiny crowdfunding page that asked for very specific things: hinges, paint, and inspection fee, instead of support. And within hours a pile of $5 and $12 and $27 donations replaced the door-sized problem with dozens of small commitments that felt exactly like a neighborhood deciding it deserved its own memory. As the sun went amber and the last screws bit into wood with that tiny celebratory chirp, Keanu carried in a long, slender case, as if he were introducing a violin to an orchestra that had never seen one. And when he opened it, the room fell into the tender kind of hush that recognizes naming as an act. The carved wooden plaque he'd once commissioned, and kept sleeping in a closet leaned against the fresh coat of primer with the patient confidence of objects that know they will outlast our noise. Sandra read the inscription twice, once with her eyes and once quietly moving her lips. The HELGAB room, for voices that might have been lost, and she felt the echo of her mother's choir inside the consonants, the way a name writes a roof over an idea. But more than pride, she felt a practical responsibility settle in, something like a cloak that doesn't burden but reminds you to keep the weather off others. They chose to let the plaque wait until inspection day, an incentive to finish cleanly, and stored it in June's office where a ficus plant could keep it company and a handwritten note. Not to be mounted until we can do it with cake. Could guard it from premature celebration. Before they left, they tested the room in the only way that mattered, with listening. Keanu threaded an old deck with one of the digitized tapes June had kept near her desk. A local woman's recollection of a neighborhood blackout in the 1980s and the week-long party that followed. And the sound ribboned into the room with the warmth of a story that had waited patiently for correct weather. She spoke of shared food and improvised orchestras of pots and spoons, and a row of candles on a stoop that turned strangers into a family not by last name but by light. As the woman's laugh filled the small space, the group stood there, not applauding, not analyzing, just measuring the acoustics of belonging against the shelves they'd built with their hands, and Sandra felt her throat tighten with the good kind of ache, the kind that tells you a day has completed its shape. They turned off the light, not with ceremony but with care, and in the corridor Micah taped a piece of paper to the door with the kind of handwriting that makes you want to try harder. Tomorrow, paint. Next day, breathe. In the truck on the way back, once the radio had decided on a song that didn't ask questions, they let the kind of silence in that friends earn by working together. Then, in a voice that tried to be casual and mostly succeeded, Sandra admitted that she'd had a flutter in her chest when the boxes tipped, and that for a slice of a second, she'd almost apologized for bringing her mother into any room at all, as if grief were an obnoxious uncle rather than a member of the family who tells the best stories late if you let him. Keanu, hands easy at 10 and 2, said there are days when he still wants to explain the inside of himself to people who haven't earned the tour and that he has started to treat the impulse like weather. Notice, prepare, but don't build a house on it. She laughed, the kind that clears a throat you didn't know was tight, and said she was adding a line to the wall of her mind. Do not spend precious commas explaining a period to strangers. He nodded like a carpenter, agreeing that the joist would indeed hold. Back home, with the recipe card propped against a bag of flour as if her kitchen were a small museum with rotating exhibits, she washed the day off her hands and texted June a photo of the plaque leaning in the office. Then one more of the shelves because sometimes proof helps a tired heart sleep. The replies came back in a ladder of emojis and one sentence that could have been a hymn. We built a room for the living today. She opened her notebook and wrote a letter she didn't intend to send to the anonymous donor who had asked for a plaque line, thanking them for reminding her to choose the kind of help that tastes like community instead of an advertisement. Then tucked it behind the panic and precision page with a paperclip, as if filing it in a cabinet labeled Clarity. Before turning in, she watched the 2-minute video they'd posted the day before, not as vanity but as calibration, and smiled at how the comments had become a bulletin board of invitations. People sharing that they had labeled boxes, dubbed tapes, sat with parents and pressed record on phones. Retired teachers offering to teach kids how to index photographs for fun in a church basement. A trucker promising to swing by with a donated mini fridge, because archivists need cold water too. She turned the phone face down, whispered thank you to no one and everyone, and stood at the sink just long enough to feel her mother's line take root again, a daily seed that kept sprouting regardless of trending weather. Sleep did not arrive like an escape, but like a room she had built on purpose. 4 walls named rest, and a door that shut gently on the day's applause and alarms. Somewhere across the city, in an apartment where the tools are stored next to the tea bags because both are used daily, Keanu sat labeling a thumb drive, HB room scan backup 01, and affixed to it a piece of blue painter's tape with the words, bring more screws, because the future loves a reminder. He thought about how most of the beautiful he has ever witnessed happens after everyone leaves, not because the crowd is unkind, but because quiet is the only solvent that lets meaning rise to the surface. He pictured tomorrow's tasks, paint permitting, a second round of fundraising that would be satisfied by $5 determinations, and felt the sort of optimism that doesn't need adjectives, just a calendar. And as the city settled into its habitual insomnias, 2 people fell asleep in different rooms under the same practical constellation. The knowledge that love is, more often than not, a series of precise, unphotographed actions that declare a person's worth in inches and labels and shelves that will never meet a red carpet, but will outlast a storm. Part 5 will step into the inspection day, the unexpected visitor with a tape that changes the project's scope, and the quiet choice that turns a room into a lighthouse without ever once using the word fame. The inspection, the tape, and the lighthouse that refused to glow for cameras. Inspection day arrived with a weather of its own, that peculiar barometric pressure made of clipboards, checklists, and the human need for things to be both safe and possible. From early morning, the community center breathed in a little shallower, the volunteers speaking in the hushed tempo of people in a library made of paint fumes and hope, while Sandra moved through the Helga B room checking the torque on brackets with a borrowed driver, and the steady focus of a person who has learned that tenderness can be measured in inch-pounds. And Keanu, sleeves pushed to his elbows, ran blue painter's tape along the baseboards in clean, unfussy lines because edges matter when you're building a memory that won't smudge. June rehearsed the 3 sentences she planned to say to the inspector, nothing defensive, all precise. And on the rolling cart near the door sat a tray of paper cups and a thermos of coffee strong enough to turn doubt into pragmatism, beside a small plate with 2 slices of almond cake, because in this universe even bureaucracy should be offered consolation. The inspector who arrived was not the skeptical man from last week but his colleague, a woman with the alert kindness of someone who knows how to walk into rooms where people have worked hard. She ran her tape across the aisles and nodded at clearances, checked the new vent and hummed approval, pushed the fire-rated door open and closed twice as if listening for any syllable of refusal. And when she asked for the maintenance schedule, Sandra handed her a single typed page that read like a poem. Wipe dust weekly with a soft cloth, test the dehumidifier every Friday, name each new tape within 48 hours of arrival. And before she could ask the inevitable about ongoing compliance costs, June explained in calm tones that the room would be supported by the smallest donors possible, the kind that keep places honest, and by a maintenance calendar laminated with the same reverence other institutions reserve for endowments. The inspector cracked the smallest smile, signed in 2 places, and left them with a sentence so practical it felt like a blessing. If you keep listening like this, the room will stay safe. It should have been the crescendo, but ours have their own choreography. And just as the celebratory tape came off the baseboards and the plaque was carried in wrapped in brown paper like a musical instrument that would debut after intermission, an unexpected visitor appeared at the threshold. An older man in a charcoal cap, holding a grocery bag with the care people use when they are carrying a thing that might rearrange a day. He introduced himself as Archero with a quick squeeze of June's hand, and a glance around the room that took in every shelf like a distant relative inspecting a family resemblance. His voice had the grain of a cassette, and in it lived a stubborn tenderness, and when he said he was there because he had heard the 2-minute video and then a neighbor's cousin told him about the room for voices that almost didn't make it, Sandra felt as if the project had sent its first ripple far enough to circle back as proof. From the grocery bag, he lifted a shoebox and a small bundle wrapped in dish-towel blue with daisy print long faded, and placed them on the work table with a formality that made everyone stand a little straighter. Inside the shoebox were labeled microcassettes and a handful of full-size tapes with dates spanning 3 decades, each wrapped with a rubber band that had become brittle with time, and a yellowing index card thickly marked in Spanglish. Mama recipes plus abuela stories plus Storm Week plus interviews and La Esquina plus Mr. L's poems. The bundle in the towel was the kind of slow-moving miracle that rooms like this were built to shelter. A handheld recorder with a cracked battery door, a little zip pouch of tiny screwdrivers, and a manila envelope addressed in a careful script to someone kind enough to keep these from becoming silence. Archero explained that his wife, Lucia, had been the neighborhood's unofficial memory keeper, the person who showed up at block parties with tape rolling, who recorded poems in barbershops and lullabies on stoops and family recipes before surgeries, who kept a monthly appointment with an elderly English teacher who once confessed that regret is mostly an argument about commas, and that when Lucia fell sick, the tapes had been pushed into a hall closet behind winter coats, because grief makes archivists of no one. Now, months after her passing, he had taken the slow inventory that widowers take, the one made of cups and drawers and size, and decided he could either continue to guard a museum inside a closet or he could deliver it to a room that looked like it would feed the living. They would have treated any donation with care, but the test of a mission is whether it recognizes its apex when the apex shows up in a paper bag. And so Sandra and Keanu and June and the volunteers created a small ritual on the spot that was nothing like ribbon cutting and everything like reception. Cotton gloves pulled on with a dignity that had nothing to do with white and everything to do with respect. A fresh intake form placed on a clipboard. A blank field labeled preferred listening context, added with a thick pen because not every story wants the same kind of light. Archero asked that Lucia's tapes be playable on family nights, that the room one evening each month be open to anyone who wanted to sit with a paper cup and hear a neighbor, that the room behave less like a vault and more like a kitchen, and the request landed in Sandra's chest like a key clicking home. While Keanu tested the deck with the most recent tape, June had wisely set up both a boombox, a digitizer, and after a glance at the cracked battery door, a spare AA pack. The first voice that filled the Helga B room was a woman speaking as if she were addressing the table at the end of a good meal, laying down a recipe for caldo verde in a tone that assumed intelligence and love from anyone listening. The room seemed to lean in, and when she shifted from parsley to a memory of the summer when the blackout turned the block into a week-long orchestra of borrowed extension cords and domino tournaments, Sandra felt the edges of the plan they had built widen, like a hand opening to carry something more. The tape changed the scope not because spectacle demanded it, but because scale had been reinterpreted by purpose. If the room was to be a lighthouse, it would not be one of those cinematic towers cutting beams across a storm for ships at sea, but a humble porch light left on for whoever needed to find the steps home. They began sketching the listening hour right there on craft paper over the work table. A monthly evening announced only on the corkboard by the door and on the library bulletin, and at the laundromat with the Saint mural. No RSVPs, no photograph policy. Bring a story and leave with someone's. A circle of chairs, a plate of store-bought cookies and someone's aunt's empanadas, and a simple guideline insisted upon by Sandra with a conviction that felt like inheritance. Stories are not content, they are food. Take only what you need and do not export without permission. Mr. Reyes, who had watched 50 years of neighborhoods gentrify and unspool and resurrect, suggested the modest addition of a first lights slot for 2 young voices each time, teenagers or quiet grown-ups who needed a gentle on-ramp, while the librarian offered to keep a ledger of what was played that would live behind the desk, not online. A catalog designed not for clicks but for return visits. Archero, eyes shiny but not broken, said he would bring Lucia's folding chair and place it in the corner by the vent, where she would sit and pretend she was a window. And there was laughter that didn't apologize for turning into something wetter. This was how a lighthouse was built without cameras. A schedule scrawled in pen, an extension cord safely taped down, a door that opened on time, and a dozen people agreeing with the steadiness of a tide, that the point of light was not to be seen from a drone, but to help feet find a threshold. By late afternoon, after the intake forms were filed and the tapes had begun their slow conversion under the calm supervision of a borrowed laptop, the room faced a brief but real crisis as inevitable as a test in any story worth telling. A digitizer glitch threatened to chew a ribbon on rewind, emitting that sickening elastic squeal that makes hearts flip and hands either freeze or fly. Keanu, who had spent enough time around machines to know that panic is the exact size to fit inside a gear, moved gently, thumb on stop, tilt of the deck, one knuckle tap to release tension like a knock on a door in a hallway nobody else can see, while Sandra breathed like her mother. S on panic and precision page had asked her to breathe, one hand flat on the steady oak, eyes naming objects that were older than any of them. The ceiling, the paint, the window frame, the idea of a room. Until the mechanism relented, and the tape resumed with a sigh so collective it almost became laughter. The team applauded not the fix, but the refusal to turn fright into drama, and someone from the after-school program slid in a plate of orange slices as if to remind them that citrus is a technology too. The scare did not deter. If anything, it hardened the room's philosophy. Progress without haste, care without ceremony, a promise to any visitor that mistakes would be met with gentleness and solved with patience, and that perfection had not been invited because perfection never listens, it only poses. What Sandra did next was the kind of quiet decision that rearranges a future more than any speech. She and June stepped into the hallway, and between a recycling bin and a bulletin board announcing free tax prep on Saturdays, agreed to cap the room's publicity at the neighborhood scale, to say no to the documentary pitch that had already arrived via someone's manager's assistant, to accept gifts of materials but refuse nameplates on the door, and to create a tiny listening fund, seeded by small monthly contributions, $5 here, 12 there. The kind of money that anyone can withdraw psychologically if the room ever stops behaving. Then, she composed a 3-sentence post for her own channels, a sibling to the first, naming Archero only by first name with permission, announcing the listening hour with a plain invitation, and scrolling past any comments that asked for behind-the-scenes photos because the only behind-the-scenes that mattered here was a shelf bracket anchored into an honest stud. Keanu, for his part, made a phone call without announcing it to anyone, to a union friend who knew where to find 24 folding chairs retired from a studio lot and happy to be useful again, and spent an hour in the loading bay with a dolly that had as much personality as some actors, whistling something that might have been a theme from a movie that had never been made. Dusk arrived wearing a color that made everything look like it belonged, and with it came the first unofficial listening hour. A rehearsal, June called it, a dress rehearsal with no dress and no rehearsal, just whoever was around when the room exhaled into evening. A circle formed without counting chairs, and Archero placed Lucia's folding chair in the corner by the vent with a little pat on the seat. And then a voice filled the Helga B room that made everyone revise their assumptions about what they had built. A school custodian in his 50s who had brought a tape labeled Mr. L's Poems and asked if someone else might read because he could not yet listen without shaking. Sandra, who has said thousands of words into cameras, asked permission to be that someone else, and when she read the first poem into the hush, she discovered a new instrument in her throat, one calibrated for the kind of line that refuses glamour, couplets about mops and fathers, about a daughter's science fair volcano, and the way baking soda teaches a child to expect eruptions without panic, about the entire philosophy of a life that believes shine is a moral stance. There were no tears that needed to be performed, only eyes that learned a new way to water, and when she finished, Keanu, sitting 3 seats down in the modest anonymity he prefers, cleared his throat of the sand its day had collected and pressed play on the tape of Lucia describing the recipe that had opened the afternoon. And so voices braided through voices, and the room did the job it had been promised, which is to let human sound prove that it can still make a roof. When the circle broke and chairs folded obediently like birds landing, there remained the work that no photo ever asks for, and that is therefore the truest. Sweeping, labeling, closing tabs on the digitizer with the careful hand of someone tucking a child's hair behind an ear, washing the coffee thermos by the sink in the kitchenette because this was a lighthouse without staff, and thus required the liturgy of closing time. And here, as so often in the life they were building, came the moment that would never be an article but would echo in the wood. Keanu waited until everyone left, until June was wrestled into taking the leftover cookies home, until Archero had been hugged within the boundary of his courage, until the librarian and Mr. Reyes and Micah had drifted toward buses and cars and bedtime. And then he did something beautiful that he would never confess to doing, a gesture that made the room steadier without making his name longer. From the truck he brought in the 2 benches he had been building in his living room out of the 2x4s he had pretended were extras, sanded until the grain felt like a memory you could sit on, finished in a natural oil that smelled faintly of walnuts and patience. He placed one beneath the window so that afternoon listeners with tired backs could lean into light, and the other along the long wall where someone might someday sit alone with a tape and not feel alone. Then he reached into his jacket and taped under the bench a small envelope addressed to future custodian, inside of which he slid a single laminated maintenance schedule and a prepaid card that would quietly replenish twice a year for filters and coffee and tape heads and paper cups. The kind of endowment that doesn't earn plaques but keeps rooms from pleading. He left a note for June. Benches were donated by someone's uncle, who insists on anonymity and better coffee, and turned out the light with the tenderness of a person who understands that darkness is not the opposite of what they're doing here, only the medium that makes it visible. Sandra returned from walking Archero to the curb and found him at the door, hand on the switch, the room behind him holding its breath like a lake at midnight. She noticed the benches because love reveals itself to people committed to learning its handwriting, and their eyes found each other in that wordless axis where thank you and you're welcome stop being separate sentences. They didn't discuss the envelope or the card or the boards that had become a place where future spines would rest. They didn't design a press release. They did what the room had trained them to do. Trust that the smallest precise act, done after everyone leaves, becomes the longest echo when the room fills again. Outside, the mural on the laundromat reflected the streetlight in a way that made the painted saint's spatula look like it was warm from use. The city threaded its nighttime needle, and two people who had not asked to be made into a story walked to their cars in a silence that felt like a vow. Tomorrow there would be more labels, a grant to finish, a teenager to teach how to clean a tape head without fear, and a handwritten sign to adjust because a comma wanted to move. Tomorrow there would also be the plaque finally mounted with cake, and Lucia's name entered into the ledger under "Brought the Lighthouse its first tide." But for tonight the Helga B room inhaled, exhaled, and settled into its purpose, a square of air arranged around listening, proof that fame is just noise unless it is translated into chairs and schedules, and a light you can find from the sidewalk without ever once needing to post about it. After the cake, the quiet, and the beautiful thing no one saw. The day the plaque finally went up did not feel like a ceremony stolen from a movie. It felt like a neighborhood deciding to keep a promise out loud. Morning came in on the backs of paper plates and extension cords, on borrowed step ladders and a plastic folding table that had survived 3 baptisms and a quinceañera, on a cake knife that had cut more victories than any resume. Sandra arrived early with a cloth bag full of small, necessary things: fresh painter's tape, a roll of labels, extra Sharpies, the little brush that kept dust from pretending it had seniority. And she set them out with the now-practiced choreography of someone who had learned how to make an archive feel like a kitchen. June moved through the Helga B room, taking attendance of details the way a mother calls the names of children before crossing a street. Vent humming its low, contented note. Dehumidifier light green. Aisles honest. Brackets true. The little ledger behind the desk ready to receive tonight's borrowed voices. Micah arrived with a roll of craft paper and a grin that meant, "I came an hour early because I like this feeling," while the librarian placed a basket of programs on a chair and admitted with a shy pride that she had made them on the library's risograph because some fonts make rooms friendlier. Mr. Reyes wheeled in a fan for the cake, not the electronics, and offered a surreptitious thumbs up to the door, which had already been opened and closed a dozen times without argument. And when Keanu walked in carrying 2 crates of folding chairs that looked as though they had just retired from a previous life of pretending to hold executives, he nodded at the plaque leaning against the wall and said the kind of sentence that keeps projects from inflating. "It'll look best after the crumbs." No ribbon waited to be cut. There was only a small length of blue painter's tape and 2 screws that knew how to behave. A steady hand drove the screws home. The wood rose into its place with the kind of fit that rewards patience. The Helga B room, for voices that might have been lost, took its breath on the wall. People clapped without being told to clap, and then they set the room the way you set a table, not for show, but because someone is coming who needs to feel expected. By mid-afternoon, the center filled with the particular electricity of a useful gathering. Children darting through adult legs with the consequence-free speed of people who know everyone in the room counts as auntie or uncle. Teenagers carrying chairs with that teenage mix of ironic commentary and unadvertised strength. Older men grateful for a task that made their hands remember. Aunties opening foil to reveal empanadas, samosas, deviled eggs that had crossed 4 blocks upright. A councilman's assistant with clipboards that never made it out of her bag, because it was obvious this crowd took minutes in their bones, not on paper. Sandra moved through it without the tilt of a person who needs to be recognized. She adjusted a chair with a foot, taped a loose cable, hugged someone's tired day out of their shoulders, and when a stranger clasped her hands and said, "You once helped me get through a night shift without quitting," she deflected with an honesty that didn't pretend to be humble. "It was probably your own voice that kept you. This is just a room to make sure it doesn't go missing." Keanu did his customary dance with the background. He cued a playlist that could be forgotten as soon as the room began, found an extra power strip like a magician produces a coin, signed for a late delivery of paper cups with a name that wasn't his and a smile that was. The only press on site was a teenager with a disposable camera who'd been told to document like a neighbor, not a paparazzo, and the rule for photos lived on an index card by the door. Faces only with permission, shelves and hands always welcome. When the time came for the first official listening hour, chairs found a circle without rehearing geometry. Lucia's folding chair took its place by the vent with a thin scarf on the back like a flag that didn't need a pole. and Archero set his palm on the plaque for one beat in a gesture that looked exactly like a blessing. The voices did what voices do when invited into a room that has been built to hold them. They built the rest of the room. A grandmother recited the recipe for a soup she swore could end arguments if served with patience, weaving in the instructions with a story about the first winter she spent in a city that did not understand her accent, and how the woman next door brought over a jar of oregano that tasted like a country not yet lonely. A boy played a cassette of his mother's laugh, and the sound made half the room look at the ceiling as if another floor had been discovered above them, a story no blueprint had predicted. A custodian whose poems had nearly buckled the rehearsal night asked if he could read one himself now, and when he did slowly with the kind of bravery that ignores that word, the room learned a new way to count time, by mop strokes, by coffee breaks, by the number of times a person chooses not to snap. Sandra read a paragraph from Helga's on panic and precision, because even joy can come too fast and need a metronome, and watched people nod in unison as if their own kitchens had been recognized. June announced the first lights of the evening, and two teenagers, a girl who coded and a boy who baked, offered a duet in the language of future competence. A recipe for cinnamon rolls, an explanation of how a loop becomes a friend, the revelation that both activities require faith in the unseen. No one in the room tried to make it content. They let it be food. In the back, the librarian took notes in the ledger with the seriousness of a surgeon and the smile of a person who knows that paper is a form of mercy. Keanu, mid-circle, leaned back just enough to relieve a man's lower spine by passing him a cushion, then leaned forward to press stop at the exact microsecond where a tape would have captured silence that didn't need to be duplicated. If anyone glimpsed his face during a poem, they would have seen an expression that looked like attention had turned into shelter. After the last cup was thrown into the bin, after the room returned itself to square and useful, after June collected the index cards with future listening hour suggestions, more water, a plant, a small clock that doesn't tick loudly, a sign asking for no perfume because old tapes have their own smells. After Archero lingered by the plaque and then left with the kind of nod that says a thing has landed, after the librarian locked the ledger away like a small treasure map, after Micah stacked the chairs in a pattern that would have made Pythagoras weep, after the last kid was retrieved by a late parent who made 3 apologies and 1 promise to attend next time, the center did what buildings do at night. It resumed ordinary breathing. June insisted on taking the leftover cake home, claiming her board met tomorrow and would benefit from believing in sugar again. Volunteers were thanked until thanks threatened to become inflation. The lights were dimmed in stages so that the room could tuck itself in. And there, precisely then, when the story had ended for everyone the story had been built to serve, Keanu waited. He waited because that is how he delivers the good that does not need an audience, by escorting the day to bed and then asking what else it needs. He waited until even the mural outside, the saint with the spatula and the wrench and the notebook, seemed to relax its painted shoulders. And then he did something beautiful that no one had requested because the best requests are the ones the heart is too shy to make. From the truck he brought in a narrow wooden box with brass hinges, the kind of thing that could be mistaken for a musical instrument case if you didn't know that music can also be made of silence kept safe. He set it gently on the work table, unlatched it with the care a person uses when opening a memory that does not belong to them, and lifted out a small, purpose-built kit he had been assembling in the months since the first digitizer cable was taped to the floor. Spare belts for the decks, a cleaning cassette, head demagnetizers, reels and spindles, felt pads, isopropyl and the good swabs, a Torx screwdriver, a labeler with backup tape, 2 packs of archival sleeves, a USB drive preloaded with instructions written in plain English and Spanish about how to rescue a tape that has curled up like a frightened creature, and a laminated card labeled Emergency Protocol for Voices that began with the sentence, "Please don't be afraid." These machines are older than your fear. In a shallow, velvet-lined compartment, he had tucked 4 crisp envelopes addressed to Future Custodian Winter, Future Custodian Spring, Future Custodian Summer, and Future Custodian Fall. Each contained a modest gift card for supplies and a note in his rounded, practical hand with a checklist timed to the seasons. Replace filters, demagnetize heads, call the electrician if the vent sounds tired, bake a cake once a year in Helga's honor and make the slice sizes generous. On the inside of the lid, affixed with glue so conscientious it would never fail the room, he had mounted a little brass plate that did not bear a donor's name but an instruction. IF found, return to the HELGAB room. It belongs to the voices. He slid the box under the work table, not to hide it, but to make it discoverable by the right eyes. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a plain, spiral notebook with the words bench notes on the cover, and on the first page he wrote, in block letters so even a future who doesn't know him could read, "How to keep the light on." Sandra returned from walking June out, having stood with her under the night for the exchange of promises that make leaders able to sleep. Yes, I'll eat protein with the cake. Yes, we'll get the second fan. Yes, I'll let someone else carry the ladder next time. And she found him with his hand on the little brass latch about to close the box. She didn't ask what it was. She had learned that naming a gift can sometimes be a way of making it smaller. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe and took in the work table with its new secret, the benches along the wall that had already learned the weight of a dozen particular spines, the plaque that had taken the wall's measure and approved, the ledger tucked away like a wallet you don't flash in mixed company, the dehumidifier light steady as a heart that has found a job. "You keep leaving behind things that tell time how to behave," she said at last, the kind of sentence a person can only say when they mean it so precisely it won't turn to sugar. He shrugged with the modesty of a craftsman whose proudest work will always be misattributed to the sturdiness of the materials. "Rooms like this take care of us," he said, "so we take care of them back." She thought of the note inside the journal that had started this exact arc, to my daughter, who always knew how to fly, and realized that flight, for the rest of her life, would look less like altitude and more like the ability to keep landing exactly where someone else needed ground. She set a palm on the plaque for a beat and then turned off the light. The room exhaled into the dark. In the days after the unveiling, kindness did what kindness does when given a job more specific than be nice. It got to work in measurable ways. The crowdfunding bar crept upward in small, satisfying increments. $5 annotated for filters, $12 for cups, $19 for batteries because my dad taught me to never trust the battery you already own, $31 for the kid who will one day find his grandmother's voice on a Tuesday, and June posted updates in sentences that would never be quoted but that made people show up again. "Air feels good. Shelves are patient. First class of kids now knows what a demagnetizer is." The librarian developed a ritual that belonged in a religion but didn't require one. Before each listening hour, she placed her hand flat on the table and named 3 things the room had taught her in the past month, almost always including the lesson that simple does not mean easy. Mr. Reyes started teaching a short Saturday class for teenagers titled Electricity Without Excuses, during which he would say, once a session, that wires behave better when spoken to kindly, and the kids would roll their eyes, then look like they might try it in private. Micah began to mentor 2 middle schoolers in the art of cutting a straight line through wood that insists on being honest, and each week they debated tiny angles the way some people debate politics, with more listening. Archero kept his promise to bring Lucia's folding chair, and once a month, a new tape, each with a story that sounded less like the past and more like a future with good memory. The mural on the laundromat received a new addition no one claimed credit for. A small carved plaque painted Trompelol into the saint's hands. The HELGAB room, because sometimes paint also wants to be a neighbor. All the while, the world outside did not grow less noisy. It never does. But inside the circle drawn by the room and its work, the noise learned to behave. Offers arrived from people who spoke fluent spectacle, and they were met with the politeness that an immune system uses to deny entry. "Thank you. Here is the link for a box of sleeves instead." A streaming platform suggested a short series. June sent back a photograph of the plaque and the single sentence, "We are not performing, we are preserving." A magazine wanted Sandra on a cover in front of the shelves. Her publicist, who had begun attending listening hours and had found her own grandmother's lullaby on a tape from '87, declined with a one-liner she'll keep in her pocket forever. "Some rooms must be visited, not consumed. Correct when necessary, redirect whenever possible." The phrase had moved from advice to infrastructure. And because the universe has a sense of humor, the real publicity that grew had the shape of invitations that cannot be measured by reach. A dozen other neighborhoods sent word that they had closets full of tapes and needed a page of instructions. A retired machinist wrote a handwritten letter offering to rebuild old decks for free if someone would ship them. A church basement decided to label its cabinets with phrases like "photographs that fix Tuesdays." A tiny network formed, not of content studios, but of rooms that wanted to remember. And the kit Keanu had built became a blueprint quietly scanned by strangers into their own versions of emergency protocols for voices, each beginning with its own tender sentence. And then, because a story that begins with one gift should be allowed to end with a different kind of gift, there came the night Sandra walked back into the theater down the alley, the one with dust motes that skate like saints when light slants correctly, and felt a fear that had been dressed as caution fold itself small and put itself away. She had, in the weeks since the plaque's rise, received a script that was not a movie, a podcast that was not advertisement, an invitation that was not an audition. At the next listening hour, if she wanted, she could play a tape that had arrived in an unmarked envelope at the center, the return address a post office box in Santa Fe, the ink faint as a telephone line in a dream. Inside was a microcassette labeled simply for the girl at the sink, with a paper-clipped note in Helga's hand she had not seen before. A story I never told, the night I almost stopped, and why I didn't. It was a voice recorded not in a kitchen but in the echo of a rehearsal hall, her mother standing at a music stand, the recorder on a piano lid, the clock of an empty room ticking under the fluorescent hum. In the recording, Helga described the year she thought nobody would ever choose her voice, how she almost packed up her scores and called it practicality, and the moment late one night when a woman she barely knew handed her a paper cup of tea and said, "Your voice is a lighthouse for 5 people. It is none of your business if the rest of the boats are elsewhere." The tape ended not with advice but with a laugh, then the sound of a door clicking as the hall closed for the night. It could not be played without changing Sandra at the bone. It could not be played without changing the room. It was, therefore, perfect. On the appointed evening, she did not dress like a star. She dressed like a daughter who had learned that legacy is not a staircase you climb, but a room you keep swept. She arrived with the tape in her pocket and a cake balanced on her forearm, the recipe card tucked beneath the plate as if one page might protect another. The circle formed, the ledger took its place, first lights were named. Archero placed Lucia's chair and someone put a new daisy in a jar beside it. The librarian smoothed the programs into a stack that looked like it could hold a small argument without wrinkling. Keanu sat as he always sat, 3 chairs to the left of the door so he could catch the hinge if it squeaked, posture easy, eyes bright, the kind of audience the world is starving to learn from. When it was time, Sandra introduced the tape with nothing like preface. "This is my mother," she said, talking about the night she almost stopped and why she didn't. "If you have ever almost stopped, please sit close." The room adjusted itself breath by breath. She pressed play. Helga spoke from the past in present tense as the best voices do. Nobody took their phone out. A teenager cried without embarrassment. An old man laughed at a line that had remembered him before he was born. When it ended, the room did not applaud because applause belongs to finishing, and this felt like beginning. They just looked at one another with the relief of people who have been given a sentence they can use on a Monday. Then someone asked if anyone else had a tape labeled for the person they used to be. 3 hands went up. The listening hour extended itself by a generous margin. Nobody minded because time, for once, was behaving. When the chairs were folded, and the cake was reduced to a constellation of crumbs and joy, and the ledger was put to bed, and June went home with the righteous fatigue of a priest who has officiated a wedding between a neighborhood and its memory, Sandra and Keanu stood in the doorway of the Helga B room and looked at the plaque the way you look at a horizon you have decided to inherit. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small folded piece of paper, the spiral edge still attached like a fringe. On it in his careful block letters was a list. Filters done, belts, spares under bench, lessons scanned plus backed up X3, first lights 2 new sign-ups, custodian fund, fall envelope loaded, Lucia's tapes digitized through 2, Mr. L's poems, request permission for pamphlet with proceeds to center. Beneath the list, a single sentence. When you are tired, sit. The room knows how to keep itself as long as we remember to listen. She folded the page and slid it behind on panic and precision, with a paperclip that had been repurposed so many times it had learned loyalty. And then, because this story began with a man waiting until everyone left, and because people do not become cliches by following their own consistencies, Keanu waited. He waited until June's taillights turned the corner and the volunteer who swept like to pretend the broom was a partner in an old song had finished and left the broom leaning as if to catch breath, and the last kid had retrieved his backpack, and the city had decided the night would be one of its merciful ones. He waited until the room was empty, and the plaque had the wall to itself, and the ledger had stopped whispering for the day. And then he did something beautiful that no camera would ever be allowed to translate into clout. He walked the length of the shelves, one by one, and with his fingertip he traced the spines of the tapes that had been returned to the world from closets and glove compartments and mornings when grief hid practical things. He stopped at Lucia's stack and placed, beside the top tape, a tiny folded note no larger than a postage stamp. "Thank you for keeping the lights on during the blackout before we had this room." He paused at Mr. L's poems and tucked a new pen in the cup with the other pens, because poets deserve the one that doesn't skip. He knelt by the lower shelf, where the first lights, tapes lived, and carefully slid a small cloth pouch into the back corner. A pouch containing 2 USB drives labeled with names nobody had yet written, but someday would, because the right kind of future supplies are those that arrive before someone needs to ask. He checked the kit under the table without opening it, the way you touch your pocket to make sure your keys exist. He looked at the benches he had made, and without moving them, set his palm flat on each as if telling the wood, "Thank you for sitting for those we love." He straightened the emergency protocol for voices card by a millimeter because the heart notices what the eye ignores. On his way out, he hung a small frame in the hallway where no spotlight would ever find it, a printed page from Helga's notebook. "Kindness keeps time," said in simple type, no decoration, under glass cheap enough to be replaced by a teenager with allowance money. And then he turned off the light. The room held its breath, then exhaled. The plaque kept silent, which is how plaques earn their keep. The Helga B room returned to the work that is both verb and shelter. Outside, the alley air was the kind that makes cities forgive themselves. The mural saint looked pleased with her armload of tools. The laundromat door chimed as someone left with clean clothes and a story to tell later. Sandra stood with her hands in her pockets the way people do when they are deciding whether to speak or let the night do it for them. "When I was young," she said finally, both to him and to the utility poles and to anyone else the quiet allowed in, "I thought the beautiful things would be the parts I could show. The red carpets, the montages, the applause. Now I understand the beautiful things are the ones that can't survive applause because they are built for rooms exactly this size." He nodded like a person agreeing to a recipe they planned to make for years. "Applause has its job," he said, "but rooms like this keep the kitchen warm." She laughed, "Which is how we sign contracts that don't require signatures. They stood a little longer, which is how we give nights permission to become mornings. And when they finally walked away, they didn't look back, not because the room didn't deserve a last glance, but because rooms this true are not kept alive by longing. They are kept alive by return." In the seasons that followed, the Helga B room did not become famous. It became dependable. The kit was used and replenished without speeches. The envelopes were opened by people who needed them and refilled by people who noticed. The benches learned the names of 100 specific backs. The ledger grew thick with handwriting that was not precious but was careful. First lights turned into second chances for some, into last words for others, into next projects for a few who discovered that preservation is a kind of birth. Other rooms opened elsewhere using different names. The anti-N cabinet, the room of Tuesday voices, the closet that turned into a choir, and they shared best practices via envelopes and phone calls and the backs of recipe cards. The mural acquired, years later, a painted tape deck at the foot of its saint that made certain children point and ask questions. And whenever the world upstairs demanded glamour, Sandra had an answer she did not have to rehearse. "I have to be at the center by 6. The dehumidifier's filter needs changing, and there's a boy bringing a tape labeled, 'My mother when she sings while cooking.'" Some nights she brought cake. Some nights she simply brought her listening. On the anniversary of the plaque, Archero spoke into the circle without looking down and said, "My wife used to say the best rooms are the ones that let you be new when you sit down." And the room agreed by staying exactly the same while letting each person inside it change by a degree that only they would measure. As for Keanu, he never stood in front of the room and told the story of what he had done there, because stories like that grow wrong if they are fed in public. But his fingerprints lived in places that didn't need highlighting, a screw that never stripped because he drove it with patience, a corner where dust never gathered because he'd shown a kid the satisfaction of making a cloth's edge find the line. A laminated card with seasons on it in a kit that kept refusing to get lost. A little maintenance fund that replenished itself like a spring because he had set it in a cycle too boring for thieves. If anyone asked him later, in an interview where the questions were better than usual, about the night he did something beautiful for Sandra, he would have smiled the way a person smiles when a truth is too precious to lay out on a coffee table. "I waited until everyone left," he might have said, "and then I tried to leave behind less work for the next good person." And if the interviewer had any sense, They would have left the silence intact and rolled to commercial without forcing it to explain itself. The last image of this chapter is not cinematic because cinema would misunderstand it. It is simply a Tuesday. The plaque is doing its silent labor. The vent hums like low gratitude. The ledger accepts a new entry in a pen that doesn't skip. The benches receive two strangers who are, by sitting, auditioning for a friendship they will pass. The kid under the table waits with one new felt pad and one new person brave enough to open it. The room inhales, exhales, keeps time. In the alley, a woman walks by with a bag of laundry and hears, through a door that is not quite airtight, the sound of a voice that belongs to someone she will never meet and somehow recognizes. She pauses, then smiles at no one, which is to say at everyone. And inside, as always, a man and a woman take turns turning off the light, not because the day is done, but because some lights only help if they begin again tomorrow.